Nehemiah chapter number 2. Nehemiah chapter number 2. And we're in verse 2, but we'll go ahead and hit verse 1 again to refresh your memory. Now, recall Nehemiah is a Jew in captivity that the Lord has, through his providence, put in a prominent position. Nehemiah is the cupbearer for the king. It's his responsibility to taste everything that came before the king. In other words, the king would not eat or drink until Nehemiah had tasted it. And there's an obvious reason for that. It's pretty popular to poison the kings and leaders back then. That was not a fairly uncommon practice. But Nehemiah's charged with that responsibility. And of course, he and the king would develop a close relationship because of that. And that you can see the hand of God's providence bringing him to that place in that position for this very opportune moment. Now recall that he saw some kinsmen coming in chapter 1, coming back from Jerusalem. And he asked how things were going down there. And of course, the answer is that they were under great affliction and reproach, that the gates were burned and the walls were torn down. It was still pretty much a shambles the way it was left in the removal. Now, of course, remember the book before this, Ezra. Ezra had left with a party to go down there and to begin rebuilding the temple. And of course, they didn't have time to build the walls and the gates, and they were suffering because of that, because the enemy was always coming in and taking pot shots at them and trying to tear down the work rather than build it up. So it was a constant struggle. But God raised up Nehemiah and put him in this very position to have an effect at the right place at the right time. Now look at verse 1. It says, "And it came to pass in the month Nisan, in the 20th year of Artaxerxes the king, that wine was before him, and I took up the wine and gave it unto the king. Now I had not been beforetime sad in his presence." Now when you're standing in the king's presence, what you supposed to be? Happy. You're supposed to be joyful. You're supposed to be in your best attitude. Why? If you make the king mad, what's going to happen? That old saying, "off with their heads." And that was a literal saying. And they would indeed, often, they would either kill them outright or put them in dungeon for not doing what they're supposed to do. And in this case, you're supposed to act. You're supposed to be happy, joyful, have a smile on your face, enjoying the presence of the king. And if it were not so, then something's going to get the king's attention, and he may take that action, such as arrest, dungeon, or murder, kill, slaughter, however you want to put it, have them executed. So, needless to say, you need to be careful when you're before the king. So, now remember, Nehemiah, once he got that news, what had he done? He mourned certain days, it says. He fasted and he prayed. Whenever you have a major event like this taking place, a major problem that comes up in your life, what should you be doing but mourning, fasting, and praying? That is an approved procedure for all of Christian life. To mourn, to fast, and to pray, and to seek God for what to do regarding that situation. Too many times we get the cart before the horse and we try to solve our own problems. That's not the way it's supposed to be. We're supposed to be dependent upon God and dependent upon His strength and dependent upon His will and His providence to help us in the times of affliction. So Nehemiah is pouring his heart out to God. And Nehemiah now has to go back to his responsibilities. He's had some time off to mourn, to pray, to fast, and he's going back to work now. And as he starts back to work, notice what he says, "Now I had not been before time sad in his presence." Okay? He said this is the first time he's ever been that way. But I want you to see how sharp this king is. Look what he says. "Wherefore the king said unto me, Why is thy countenance sad, seeing thou art not sick?" The king saw that he was troubled. Now you stop and think about it. What would you look like if you'd been mourning, fasting, and praying for a certain time? Your eyes are going to be what? Red, bloodshot, tears, stained cheeks, tired looking. And then you can tell you're in this sad condition. And somebody looks at you and can tell, hey, something's not right with them. Well, the king was very astute, and he saw that Nehemiah was sad, but not only sad, notice what else he says here. "Seeing thou art not sick, this is nothing else but sorrow of heart." Okay? So Nehemiah doesn't realize he's showing his feelings to the king. Now, what could happen to Nehemiah for doing this? Look at the last part of that verse there in verse 2. It says, "Then I was" what? Very sore afraid. In other words, them knees are starting to knot because he's messed up. You're not supposed to be that way in the king's chamber. You're not supposed to be that way in front of the king. You're supposed to be at the top of your performance. You're supposed to be outgoing. You're supposed to be joyful. You're supposed to be enjoying the king's presence. And all those things, now he's off his game because of this news. And God's going to use this as an opportunity for Nehemiah to make a request unto the king. Now the king notices, he says, "You're not sick. So what's going on? This is a heart trouble. This something is burdening you. Tell me what's going on." Now you see the king's very observant because he saw Nehemiah. He knew how Nehemiah was. He knew how he normally acted, how he was always in good form, always in good cheer. But on this occasion, he sees Nehemiah and says, "Whoa, what's going on with Nehemiah? Something's going on." And he says, "You're not sick. I know when you get sick. I can tell that. I watched that, as a matter of fact. If the cupbearer's getting sick, what happens? The king don't eat." So he's very careful in observing Nehemiah. And he saw the fact that Nehemiah was indeed sad and that he had a heart problem, not a physical problem. And notice what he says to the king. He says, "And said unto the king, Let the king live forever." Now, if you're the cupbearer, that's a pretty good thing to wish. If he lives, you're going to live. All right? He said, you're working for him. And if he lives, then it's a pretty good thing you've done the right thing in tasting all of his food and his wine, because you're alive, you're being blessed. So he says, "O king, live forever." Now notice what he does. "Why should not my countenance be sad when the city, the place of my fathers' sepulchres, lieth waste, and the gates thereof are consumed with fire?" So what's he doing? Right, he's catching the king up. Now the king might not know this. That's very possible. And you think of how many provinces and how many countries that Nebuchadnezzar had conquered. It was the whole existing world at that time. All of the nations that were around belonged to Nebuchadnezzar. And it's very likely, since Nebuchadnezzar's gone on now, and this is the replacement king from Persia, the Medo-Persian Empire, they might not know what's going on in Jerusalem. But now notice what he says. He says, the city, the place of my father's sepulchres, lieth waste. and the gates thereof are consumed with fire. All right? The gates are consumed with fire. So what's that mean? What good is a gate if it's been burnt? It won't do anything with it but hang there if it's still hanging. You see, a gate back then was designed to keep the enemy out, to protect the citizens within, to keep them safe during trouble. Of course, the walls were supposed to do that too, and the walls are torn down. The gates have been burnt so that they can't be shut. So what does that mean for the enemies of the Jews? They just come and go as they please, huh? Nobody can stop them. They're too strong for the weak Jews. So as this is going on, this city has gone in disrepair for so long. Nehemiah has been praying and fasting and asking the Lord to show him what to do. And the king, notice the king makes a response here. Then the king said unto me, For what dost thou make request? Now notice what he does. So I prayed to the God of heaven. So notice that now the king has said, What do you need, Nehemiah? Don't you see God's hand working this together? He puts it in the king's heart to do what Nehemiah is wanting to do. But notice also he says, So I pray to the God of heaven. What's he doing? He's standing in front of the king having a conversation. So what he does is he said, Wait a minute, king, time out. I need to pray. And he prays right there in front of the king. And he prays and seeks God's will and what should be done. And the king says, What you need, Nehemiah? So you can see this, that for, remember, 70 years they've been in captivity. For 70 years the city has been in disrepair like that. Now here recently, 10 years before, Ezra has gone to the city, and he hasn't made much progress because of the isms, the schisms, the enemies, all of that. They've been working on the temple, but it's not coming together. And they still hadn't got to the outward defenses yet. So Nehemiah has the burden now. Nehemiah has the position to show that burden to the king, and the king asks him, What you want? And I like how it says, So I prayed before the God of heaven. Let me read that again. It says, So I prayed to the God of heaven. So before I open my mouth, king, let me pray. Now that's an interesting thing in and of itself. That shows you Nehemiah was a devoted Jew that loved the Lord. He was a determined Jew. He was going to get this resolved. And he knew that if he could present this problem to the king, and the king could take care of it. The king had the power. So the king says, What do you want? What's your request? Now it's interesting how Nehemiah, for those time that he was a cupbearer, had always pleased the king. He'd always done exceptional in his job, in his performance. And that gave him that relationship with the king that he needed to have in order for this new thing to be taken care of. It was the only way that it could be taken care of was God's providence moving Nehemiah to this place and this position. Now Nehemiah could have said, Nah, I don't want to be a cupbearer. That's too dangerous. He could have said that. Said, I think I'll just be a rock layer. And done that and, done his job and not been bad at it. He was good at it. He was a good leader. But he, through providence and through God's moving behind the scenes, is at the right place at the right time to have an effect on the problem. To begin that motion back to Jerusalem. And if you look at this year, the 20th year of Artaxerxes, That's when Daniel's 70 weeks starts, from that point forward. So you think about the importance of this event, the day that God spoke of to Daniel, that God spoke of to Jeremiah, that God spoke of to the other prophets, the day that Israel would begin to start to go back home. A very important date. And they did go back home after that 70 years. And here's Artaxerxes now fixing to answer Nehemiah's petition. So what does Nehemiah do before he opens his mouth and puts his foot in it? What does he do? He prays. Let me submit unto you that we at the same time should, before we ask for something, before we decide we're going to do something, let's go before God to make sure we got it right. Let's double check. He'd been fasting and mourning and praying, and I believe he had an idea what God was going to do, but the circumstances had to line up just right. And if they didn't, then Nehemiah would have lost his position and probably lost his head. But God put it in the heart of the king because Nehemiah had developed that relationship with the king and developed that closeness to him, that the king was willing to give him what he wanted. You think about that, how special that relationship would be, because the king's life depended upon Nehemiah every single day. Now, if your life depended on somebody doing something for you every day, don't you think you'd be appreciative of that person? Don't you think you'd be grateful for that person that you're depending upon, and that they're faithful to their job, they're faithful to you, they're faithful to do what they're supposed to do, and they do it well. They don't just take a stab at it and say, well, I believe I'll take a little sip today. No, you're supposed to take a full sip. You're supposed to take a full bite of each little portion on the king's plate. You got to taste it first. Now, you think about that. God puts Nehemiah in a place where he can eat T-bone steak every day. Well, the rest of the Jews, they might not have it so good, but he's eating good. He gets the best of the best. And he gets it, but there's a danger attached to that, because somebody don't like the king. That's how they got rid of kings, either assassination or through poisoning. That's how they got rid of them. But God had blessed Nehemiah and kept that off of him, and kept that off the king. And that helped to cement that relationship with the king. So Nehemiah is in the right position. He's developed that position. He's developed that relationship with the king. God has blessed him and honored him and kept him safe. And now that friendship is what's going to make things happen. So remember, when God's using you in your daily life, remember to be faithful to what you're doing. Be good at what you do. And be the example that you need to be before the king. Try your best to develop those relationships that you can, that God might use that relationship to change things. Salvation is the main thing for us, that men, women, boys, and girls would be saved. And through our contacts, through our relationship, God gives us those opportunities to witness and to testify to the lost. So take advantage of those opportunities and be prepared to be the best you can be. It says, do all with your might. Do our jobs with all our might. Do them well. Don't be a half employee, be a full employee. Do your job well, and God can use that in opportunities to be a witness to others. So Nehemiah now has come in, and he looks all messed up. His hair's a mess, I don't doubt. His face, his eyes are swollen and bloodshot. He's been crying. You can tell he's been crying and mourning. He's lost a little bit of weight. And the king says, you're not sick, Nehemiah, because I know when you get sick, what's going on with you? And here comes out, before he can even think about it, well, king, my people are in disrepair. The graves of my fathers are lying waste in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem's still in a burnt and torn down condition. And then the king says, what do you need, Nehemiah? What's your request? So Nehemiah says, wait a minute, king. Before I tell you, let me pray. And that's something too. He wasn't afraid to pray before the king. That tells you him and the king had probably prayed before. Him and the king had been getting along pretty good. And no doubt Nehemiah had led in prayer with the king several times. Because notice how quickly he does that. He doesn't do it with hesitation. He just says, so I prayed to the God of heaven. Right then, he prayed and asked for God to give him the right words to request what's going to happen next. So as we look at that, go ahead and read ahead and see what's happening here. See what's going to happen, what the king allows for Nehemiah to do. All right? And this is, like we said, the beginning. This chapter is like the beginning of the return of the Jews back to the promised land. So what a blessing it is to be chosen by God to be in that place and at that opportune moment to begin to bring the Jews back home through Nehemiah. So think about that and make application of this in our own lives, how God puts us in the very special places that we're in, and how he uses us through his providence to be a light and a witness at the opportune moment. So think about that this afternoon. All right, we'll stop there. Let's all stand. We'll close with a word of prayer, and we'll be dismissed. Brother,